AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former U.S. intelligence officers and those who write about them. And today I am delighted to welcome back the Kim brothers. Yesterday, we recorded an initial session about their amazing story. And today we're going to continue and finish the story. Joining me today are Richard Kim, Arthur Kim, and the author, Robert Kim. But we finished yesterday's recording with the U.S. Army's liberation of Shanghai, where the Kim family members had been living. And now this amazing story continues. Dick, tell us about the period of time in Shanghai after the liberation of Shanghai, and then the brief period before communist forces come in, and then what happens once the communists take over Shanghai.
Well, when Pete went to Shanghai and on August 1945, I went back to Shanghai in September of 1945 to establish the Shanghai Base Command. And when I arrived, of course, that was the first time after a year that I'd been gone. And that's when, shortly after that, Jim in October came to Shanghai. One of the stories that I want to comment on from the other segment, Jim, is the fact that when Peter and I escaped from Shanghai in 45, we happened to be taking the same route that the Chinese guerrillas had taken the Doolittle flyers, and Jimmy Doolittle and some of his pilots. And as we stopped in one of the villages, the Chinese magistrate of that village had pictures of the Doolittle boys in his office, very proud. And that the Doolittle raid was in 42, remember? And in 1945, he still had those pictures in his hut. That was in occupied China, but of course, the Japanese only occupied the major cities. The countryside was pretty much under the control of guerrillas. But anyway, when I arrived in Shanghai, I arrived in a plane and stayed at the naval building that night, and called Mom on the phone and told her that I was in town. And soon after that, I went home to Shanghai to join the family. Of course, who was home was David, Arthur, Betty, and Mom. And I then was involved in helping to set up the Shanghai Base Command. But Mom and Dave and Betty being an American citizen, having been born in Los Angeles, was pretty much free. But Mom and Dave and Art was in Shanghai. But then when the Chinese communists took over in 1949, only Dave, Mom, and Betty were in Shanghai. Art had already left Shanghai and gone to the States. But Mom and David and Betty escaped and went to Hong Kong when the communists came in. Mom thought that she could live in communist China. She did during the Japanese occupied China, but found that was not so. And so she and David decided to leave Shanghai and go to Hong Kong. It turned out that a neighbor of ours, who was a communist leader of the community, knew the family well enough that he then assisted Mom and Dave to escape, at least to acknowledge that they were neighbors and friends, and didn't say anything about their leaving Shanghai. And David turned the house over to one of his co-workers who he had saved during a fire of the company where they worked. And so this friend of Dave's stayed in the house and helped them leave Shanghai and go to Hong Kong. Mother, wise mother, had layers of clothes on so that she would just shed one outfit and shed the other outfit without carrying a lot in the baggage. But then when they went to Hong Kong, to the border area, the Chinese communists, of course, were watching, and they had the baggage all laid out, and they were inspecting the baggage. And one of the bags that they looked at happened to be Mom and Dave's bag, but the lid was very heavy. And they thought, in the Chinese expression, "ji gua," that's funny. And they cut through the layer and found that there were flattened gold in the lid of the suitcase. And of course, they put it back and turned to the crowd and asked who this suitcase belonged to. Mom and Dave did not acknowledge that they owned the baggage. So the first opportunity, they crossed the bridge and went to Hong Kong without the bags. It turned out that Dave's friend, who had tried to give Dave and Mom American money that he had somehow saved, and they refused to take it. But then they said, well, take the suitcase. But in the suitcase, the friend had flattened his gold bars that he had, and then assumed that they would take it into Hong Kong and then have money there. But the friend continued to live in the house, thinking that eventually we would return to claim ownership. But as Art then took Dave and his daughter Anne and me back to Shanghai, so 50 years later, and went to the house where we lived, and lo and behold, the guy was still there. And the old Chinese expression, of course, we hadn't seen him in 50 years, but nothing had changed in the house. Paintings were the same, old green wall here and there. There was the telephone on the mezzanine floor, 77554, still there. And he thought we had come to Shanghai to reclaim the house. Art told him, no, the house belonged to him, that Mom and Dave wanted him to own the house. So he lived in the house, but he had to have a communist family live on the bottom floor, and they occupied the second and third floor of the house. But they settled in Hong Kong, and then Art, being in California, lived with brother Peter and Ruth, but that didn't go well. So Arthur then has a story of his own about trying to join the army, but being a non-citizen, it was a little difficult for him because they wouldn't draft him and they wouldn't even enlist him. So Art can tell the story about his going to Hawaii and going to high school there and convincing the draft board to draft him. But that's a story in itself.
Only James and Betty were American citizens at that time. None of the rest of you, a number of you were serving in the U.S. Army, were American citizens. There's an amazing story of how James and Peter established contacts with the U.S. Congress through their military contacts and worked a number of bills through the House of Representatives and through the Senate to have the rest of you made American citizens. Tell that story.
Well, thanks to Brother Jim. I mean, he's just a remarkable brother. He was a student at Georgetown University, and of course, the professor knew what Jim was doing. And being an officer in the Army and decorated from World War II, he was well received by the various congressmen and newsmen that he met. But Peter was also a non-citizen, lived in Shanghai. And the question of his being an officer and being a non-citizen were issues with the family. So that was one of the things that Jim worked on, to get Congress to give Peter citizenship, and that happened. And then also to give him a rank of officer, to promote him as an officer, and that again by act of Congress. And then continue to work on bills to make me a citizen, make Art a citizen, and citizen for brother David and the mother. But I had already come to the States as an Army sergeant discharged at Campbell, California in 46. Jim met me there. And when I got discharged, I was sent to Mount Hermon School in Massachusetts. And being a non-citizen, the year I was in Mount Hermon, I got a letter from the Immigration Bureau saying that I was illegal and that I would be deported. And so, I said, deported to where? China was occupied by the communists. And so, anyway, Jim got involved, and I eventually had to go to Philadelphia, and I was allowed to stay because Jim had worked on a bill to make me a resident and eventually a citizen of the U.S. while I was in school.
Story about Jim appearing in his Army uniform at one of the committee hearings in Congress.
Well, yes, he even walked into a Senate meeting when the committee was gathered, and he walked right in with his host, who was a senator himself, and that was an interesting meeting.
Quick, tell the audience about moving to Hawaii, attending high school, and then eventually enlisting in the U.S. Army.
Well, we left Shanghai as aliens, Chinese citizens, mother and I, on a Army trooper. And we landed in Honolulu on the 29th of August, 1947. And school started on the 2nd of September. I was very thin, very pale. In Honolulu, of course, I stood out like a sore thumb because everybody was dark-skinned from the sun and spoke pidgin English. And when I enrolled in school, I was tested in English, and the vice president lady came in and introduced herself and said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Shanghai." And at that time, my name was Arthur King, because the character Kim in Chinese is pronounced Jing, and they romanized it King. And so my name was Arthur King, which is anglicized actually in Honolulu. And the vice president, after 5 minutes of talk, said, "Where did you learn your English?" I said, "At home." And she was confused. Can you imagine here, an Asian speaking English, fluent English, and saying that I was brought up speaking English? And she said to me, she said, "I think I will send the Honolulu kids to China to learn English," because I didn't speak pidgin English.
But Art, you were in California before you went to Hawaii to go to school.
No. I landed on Honolulu deck. Mom and I were on a trooper on 29th of August. School started on the 2nd of September. And I graduated from Honolulu. And as soon as I graduated, Mom said, "I'm going back to Shanghai." She was very attached to the house. And she says, "You're on your own." So I lived with the minister, and I was a houseboy there, but there was no income. I lasted in the University of Hawaii only one semester with no income. And Pete in Carmel at Fort Ord asked me to join him in California. And he got me enrolled in Monterey Peninsula College. I didn't get along with my sister-in-law, and I was enrolled in Monterey Peninsula, and shortly afterwards, Pete got signed to Korea. So here I am living with my sister-in-law, with whom I didn't get along. So I left Carmel and went to Modesto and lived with a minister secretary as a houseboy. And again, there was no income. And I used to pick peaches with a three-legged ladder. I was 119 pounds. And can you imagine me carrying a three-legged ladder that was 12 feet tall? Picking. The way I got paid was the number of peaches that filled a crate. It was $2 a crate. I think I made $3. 3 crates the whole day that I was there. But I didn't last long. And so when the Korean War started, I decided to join the Army and went down to the recruiting sergeant. He had me fill out some forms. And he said, "Oh, you speak Chinese?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Great." And then he says, "I can't take you because you're not a citizen." And he says, "Go see my colonel." So I went to San Francisco, saw the colonel, and the colonel says, "No problem. I'll send a Twix to Pentagon, get a waiver." And a week or so later, he called me and said, "I don't understand, but the Pentagon denied the waiver. We can't take you in the Army." So I then decided to return to Honolulu and get drafted. I had registered for the draft in when I turned 18 in Honolulu. And so I returned to Honolulu, and the draft board says, "We can't draft you because you have a student visa." And I said, "I just quit school." 3 months later, I was drafted. And I'll never forget June 29th, 1955, was it? Anyway, I joined the Army, and I was at Schofield Barracks for 16 weeks. And I did very well in the training. In fact, I have a picture that the Lieutenant General signed because I was selected as selected number 1 in the basic training for the first month. It was quite an honor. But that's how I got in the Army. And concurrent with my service in the military, Jim's bill included me in his bill that he had for Mother and Dave when they were stuck in Honolulu and Hong Kong, and enabling me to reside as a permanent resident in the U.S. But after I served 3 years in the Army, I was naturalized when I got discharged, and that the outfit, the agency recruited me.
So the Korean War comes along. James, Dick, and Art all end up serving in Korea with intelligence. Starting with James, talk about each one of you and where you went and what kind of a unit you were with and how you served.
Well, Pete served first. He was with the unit that pushed all the way up to the Yalu River. And then the unit got pushed all the way back to Busan, the southern tip of Korea, when the Chinese entered the war. And Pete, he was very fortunate. You can imagine it was very tough for Asian Americans to be in the U.S. Army because most people, Caucasian in the Army, didn't recognize Asian Americans being in uniform. And we had to be very careful that we did not become prisoners of our own army because we were Asian. They didn't understand how we could be an American in the U.S. Army. In my case, when I got my first stripe, I looked for the largest, biggest PFC stripe to put on my uniform. So the MPs would know that I was a GI and not a Korean soldier.
Talk about where each of you served in Korea and what kind of units you were with.
Well, I joined when I got to Korea, I was pulled out of the unit. I was headed for the front line. And Pete was then a captain, and he served in the G2 in 8th Army in Seoul, the capital of Korea. And he made sure that I was not going to the front lines. And he intercepted me in Seoul and got me assigned to 302nd Military Intelligence Service Company, the unit that he served in his first tour, and became an interrogator. I was trained in Japan. I was pulled off the ship in Japan and went to interrogation school because I spoke Chinese. And when I got to Korea, I was assigned to 302nd, the same unit that Pete was assigned to earlier. And I became an interrogator of Chinese prisoners.
Where did you serve in Korea?
Well, I didn't go to Korea. I was with the CIA. I was one of the early unit. I was attached to CIA from the Army, but I was in college in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The chief of chaplains of the division happened to be the rector of the church I attended. And when he saw that I was going to school under the GI Bill, he encouraged me to join the National Guard so I could make extra money. So I did, and went to the 28th Infantry Division National Guard and served with the G2 section as the NCOIC. But then the Korean War broke out, and President Truman activated 4 divisions, and the 28th happened to be one of the divisions he called up. And the division was then sent to Indiana for training for deployment to Korea. But in Indiana, as we were training, I was called out of the unit and given a direct commission as second lieutenant. And the division went to Europe, didn't go to Korea. I was shipped to the 525 Military Intelligence Fort at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and served with the intelligence unit there, went on maneuvers, and came back to Fort Bragg. And lo and behold, there was a brown envelope waiting for me, telling me to report to Washington. No details, but just to go to Washington and report to building so-and-so. And it turned out to be the CIA headquarters on East Street, I believe it was. And there I then was joined with the CIA, went through training at the camp, and then deployed to Tokyo, Yokosuka, to the CIA station there, and served there for a year. And then one of the officers established a substation in Tokyo. And so then I was moved up to Tokyo, and with 2-3 other case officers. And Jim Lilly, Ambassador Jim Lilly, was my successor when I completed my tour at the substation in Tokyo. But I then was asked to remain in the CIA, but I wanted to join the paramilitary forces. I wanted to be in the CIA with the paramilitary force. I knew that they were training at Fort Benning and Fort Bragg, but then the Army had established the Special Forces in 1952. And so when I got out of the agency in 55, I told them that I would leave and join the Special Forces if I was not made a regular Army officer. I would then come back to the agency and serve in the agency. But lo and behold, I was made a regular Army officer in the Special Forces, trained at Fort Bragg, and then I eventually went to Fort Benning to infantry school. And then I was sent to Colorado to command a company in the Armor Division. And there I was then ordered to go to Bateau, Germany, to join the 10th Special Forces Group. And this is where I spent most of my career, in the 10th Special Forces. But during the Korean War, I served in Japan with the agency and deployed agents to China from Japan. And that's when the 2 U.S. case officers were captured, Donlin and Fecto. And then I decided to make a career of the Army, and I served in the Army for 25 years and got out in 1971. And at that point, went to seminary and became a priest.
After you served with Army intelligence in Korea, you joined CIA, right?
I was being discharged in Honolulu, and I stopped from Korea, went to Japan to be processed and get on a ship. And all of a sudden, I get orders to report to a nondescript building at Camp Drake. And went to this building, and there was no military uniform there. Everybody was in civilian clothes. And I didn't understand what kind of a unit this was, but I reported there and met a man in civies, and he says, "You're going back to Korea." He says, "But you're not allowed to contact your former unit, and we're going to send you back in civilian clothes." I said, "I have no civilian clothes." So, well, we have an allowance. I bought civilian clothes. He gave me, at that time, it was a lot of money, $90 per diem. And I got on a plane, went back to Korea, reported to a place called JAC, Joint American Commission Korea, headed by John Hart, a phony colonel. He was, at that time, was known as mission, chief of mission. And that unit was only a block away from my 302nd Military Intelligence Service Company. So I knew the building. It was known as JAC. And so I reported there in civies, and they said, "You cannot go to the PX to buy anything. We will buy it for you. You cannot go back to the unit that you served in. Here's your BOQ, and you can only wear civies." I was mystified. I didn't understand what was going on. I mean, as a sergeant, and I met this Colonel John Hart. Jim was assigned as chief of base in Busan, the tip of southern Korea. And he didn't tell me anything about this. But apparently, John Hart, I had met him on one of Jim's TDY from Busan. And John Hart met me, and he found out that I spoke Korean and Chinese. My Korean was not that good. I mean, it was acquired. I didn't have any formal language training, but I was able to manage to speak Korean. Little did I know that I was being tested when I was taken out to lunch by a translator that the station had and a nurse, a Korean nurse. Evidently, they reported back to John Hart to say that this man speaks fluent Korean, which was not true, but that's what they reported. As a result of that, I spent 90 days working for Toddy Waters, was her name. And on my way back, I got discharged in Honolulu, became a naturalized U.S. citizen by virtue of my military service. And then I was met by another person in civies and says, "We're sending you to Washington." And I didn't question who this guy was. He never identified himself. So he gives me the per diem, and I go back. I ended up in Washington and lived served in this temp building. In those days, the agency didn't have a headquarters building. They were in temporary wooden buildings on Constitution Avenue. And so I report there, and then I took some training. The training was not formal, unlike what Dick got. It was safe house training. After 90 days, I was sent back to Korea, and again told not to contact my unit, and served there as a contract officer. After 2 years of service in Korea, I was returned to Washington and made a staff officer, and had subsequent assignments to Hong Kong, Laos, Japan, and retired after 22 years. I got out early.
It's a wonderful story. Gentlemen, I have one final question for you. Let's start with Dick and then Art and finish up with Robert. And that is, what is the Kim family legacy?
I'm sorry?
Well, the Kim family legacy.
Legacy.
Robert, you're going to tell him that?
I want to hear what you and Art think.
Well, I don't know. The story I would tell would be that it has been a long journey to become an American citizen in a land of the free and home of the brave. And that's our beloved America. All our lives, we wanted to be Americans. We identified as Americans, but didn't officially become Americans until we were naturalized by act of Congress. But that would be our legacy, I suppose, that we survived the Japanese occupation. I didn't live in China during the communist occupation. Mother and Dave and Biddy did. But Jim is just one of those remarkable people. One of the things that I want to add about Jim is that when he worked through the Congress to get all these bills passed, the President Truman's secretary personally called Jim on the phone to inform him that the bill was on the president's desk and that he was going to sign it. That just doesn't happen these days. But that's World War II is a different era completely.
Well, Jim was working. He was at Georgetown under GI Bill, but he also worked as a switchboard operator for Georgetown University. And he got the call from President Truman's secretary while he was on the switchboard.
Well,
what do you think the Kim family legacy was?
Jim's legacy would be the fact that he was able to work through Congress like no other congressman could work through Congress. But Jim was just one of those very charismatic individuals who got along with the congressman, every congressman he met. In fact, when Dave was still in Hong Kong, because a corrupt consular officer wouldn't certify Dave to go to the States, claiming that he had TB. And of course, that was not true. But so Jim had to go back to the Congress and get the congressman to work on this. And the Congress had heard about corruption in Hong Kong. And so he was interested in knowing who this consular officer was. But in any event, an exchange of communication back and forth, Dave was then certified, but the congressman had worked with a friend of his who was an executive with the Pan Am Airlines and arranged for Dave to ride as an executive of the Pan Am on the only seat on the plane coming out of Hong Kong was the first class plane for a key person of the Pan Am service. And so for $650, Dave came from Hong Kong to Honolulu on Pan American Airport because of Jim's work with the Congress.
How about you? What do you think the Kim family legacy was?
Me?
Art.
Oh, good grief. We were brought up, as Dick says, as American citizens. The first language we learned was English. And we went to American schools, British schools in Shanghai. And anytime we were asked our nationality, we would say that we were American citizens. I didn't know that I was not a U.S. citizen until the war started. And as a kid, I never questioned the adults in the family to know the difference. I came to the States, as I said earlier, as a Chinese citizen and became naturalized after serving in the U.S. Army. But we're so grateful for being naturalized U.S. citizens.
You're right about that. Jim, there's something that Art, I did not know until very recently, that Art was recommended for bravery for his actions in Vientiane, Laos, when Laos was taken over by the communists. And he was recommended for bravery for having gone back to the evacuated compound to destroy documents in a safe. And he spent a day and a night shredding the documents and pouring water on the shredded documents. But that's 50 years ago. He was never awarded the Medal for Bravery, which I only found out very recently. So I've undertaken personally to see to it that he gets that decoration. And before I pass on, he's going to get that decoration, because I wrote to the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, sent him a long letter back in June, never got a reply. So last week, wrote to the president himself, enclosing all the correspondence to John Ratcliffe and also a copy of the correspondence to my representative, informing them of this award. And so I'm hoping that Art gets that award before we pass.
Best of luck. Robert, how about you? What's the Kim family legacy?
Well, it's extremely difficult to follow that, but I think that my position as someone outside of the Kim family, I guess maybe gives me a little bit of a different perspective on it. I mean, what I thought about their story from the beginning, when I first met Art 7 years ago, and he started to tell me about the story of their coming to America, is that it is one of the heroic, epic stories of coming to America of all time, comparable to anything in our nation's 250-year history, going back to 1776. And to be a part of recording this story and passing it down to future generations is an exceptional honor. I believe that the story of perseverance, of dedication to the United States of America is going to be retold for many years to come. And I believe that will be a key part of their legacy. And another part, which in a way is still being written, is their role in long forgotten events of the Second World War that impacted the lives of thousands. And furthermore, their contributions to the earliest years of the intelligence community and military special operations. Once again, that's a story that we are just starting to tell. The award that Art did not receive for his actions in toward the end of the conflict in Southeast Asia is just one of multiple parts of this. We have also nominated Peter for admission into the Army Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame, which hopefully will be judged favorably later this month. I believe that although he resists it, Dick will possibly be nominated for the Special Forces Hall of Fame. Although much like Art with his renomination for the award for his actions in Laos, he strangely seems to resist it. But these will all be efforts to try to consolidate the legacy of the Kim family in the intelligence community and military special operations in its institutions for many years to come.
I want to give a shout out to Terry Shima, whom you met. It was Terry Shima who got us started on this particular route and getting Peter's award in the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. Terry Shima also interviewed me and made that a matter of record in the NARA research agency. And he of course knew Art as well, but Terry is 103 years old now.
Well, it's been a great privilege to witness this history. I am very pleased and proud that AFIO is able to play a small role in bringing this story to the American public. I want to thank Richard and Arthur and Robert Kim for telling a wonderful, patriotic American story.
Well, thank you for sponsoring this.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Jim.
AFIO is a small, nonprofit, apolitical, educational organization whose main mission is to help prepare the next generation of intelligence officers to confront the challenges our nation faces in the years ahead. To learn more or support our outreach programs, visit www.afio.com.